for the next election. So once that candidate was nominated, that's who the next president was going to be. Nevertheless, people would vote, and people were expected to vote, and people were required to vote, right? But the point of an election was not to decide an outcome, but to ratify a decision that's already been made at another level. And that's exactly how Lucha Libre matches work. There's this decision that's made at another level, who's going to win and who's going to lose, but how the match is played out matters a lot. And people are there not really to see who's going to win and who's going to lose, but what's going to happen? How are they going to win? How are they going to lose? What kinds of resentments are going to be able to be played up after one of them loses to the other? So, by the 1980s, by the late 1980s, that kind of implicit critique fed into this celebration of Lucha Libre by a particular set of artists, writers, theater people, and political organizers who thought about it as reappropriating the idea of lo naco, which is a derogatory term for kind of the popular class in Mexico. And so what Super Barrio emerged out of was this reappropriation, this partly tongue-in-cheek, partly serious celebration of Lucha Libre, which was something that if anybody middle class looked down on, as this kind of Mexican art form, as this working class culture. And it did have a couple of effects. One is that it did provide this kind of artistic and performative genre of political action. It also brought attention to Lucha Libre back to the mass media. And probably for that reason, or at least in part for that reason, in 1991 they decided to put it back on the air. And that had a number of effects, some of them probably intended, some of them probably unintended. One of the effects was that all of a sudden people who would never set foot in an arena could watch it on television and did watch it on television. And it started to develop this middle class audience. And up until then, except for things like those comics you saw or these little like figurines that are made in like tiny shops up in some of the peripheral neighborhoods of Mexico, nobody was really making a lot of money off of Lucha Libre, off of using it to sell things. But that all changed after it was televised. So in the 1990s, by the end of the 1990s, into the beginning of the 2000s, what I started to see after I'd already finished the research was this proliferation of the kind of imagery of Lucha Libre being used in ways that were explicitly mass-mediated and explicitly used in things like advertising. So, or taken out of its Mexican context. So one thing was the cartoon Mucha Lucha. Has anybody ever seen it? Okay. Which was developed by two Australian fans of the El Santo movies, but they pitched it to Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers put it on the air in the US as a cartoon, and then it gets shipped to Mexico. That's Blue Demon, that's actually Blue Demon Jr., and he is letting me know that he will have extraordinary powers if you drink the blue color full throttle energy drink. That's Mama Lucha, who is, what do you call it, an icon, she's the advertisement for a supermarket chain. So it starts getting picked up in this way that it hadn't gotten picked up. And what I would argue is that by getting picked up, it gained a certain kind of respectability, that it had a kind of middle-class respectability that lacked in the 1950s through the 1990s. But if I can go back represented the country as a whole. So they were neither right-wing nor left-wing. You vote for the PRI because a vote for the PRI is a vote for Mexico. And the other sort of piece of legitimation, the other piece of that legitimation puzzle for the PRI was kind of like El Santo. They were modernizers. They were nationalists and they were modernizers. And in fact, the PRI tried to sort of put up their own social wrestlers in response to Super Barrio and these other social wrestlers in the 1990s. They never really were very successful. But the thing about the PAN is that the PAN was explicitly, although its initial stand for the Party of National Action, they were never populists. Okay, so the PRI, you could see how they would want to appeal to this populism that wasn't part of the PAN strategy. And they really wanted close relations with the US. And they were explicit about that. And that in Mexico signals a kind of rejection of nationalism. So why Místico? And I think that the reason is that they were presenting a strategy of legitimation that was completely novel to Mexico, or at least novel for 20th century Mexico and 21st century Mexico. So if in the past, the way that Mexican government, or the way that the Mexican government in the 20th century legitimated its rule, right, was by promising to be a kind of populist and, well, let's see, advancing this populist, sometimes xenophobic modernity. What the PAN was promising was safety. So if you look at the way that the US government has tended to legitimate itself, and you can see this in pretty much any kind of political cycle, in the US government tends to present the United States as the sort of the good guys, right? We're the defenders of the good. And if measures have to be taken, they have to be taken because we have to protect the innocent. That was never really an important element of the PRI's legitimation in Mexico. But it became absolutely essential after 2006 when, for the second time, the PAN won the election in Mexico. It won the election through this very, very deeply contested and deeply dividing election. I was there at the time, and it was not clear to me what was going to happen after that election, because all of the rituals through which the government was legitimated just didn't happen. Like, all of the political rituals that you would expect in the presidential transition did not happen. So it was really an open question. By 2009, Mexico was deep into the drug war, and the drug war served and served until the last election, and to some degree continues to serve as a kind of legitimation for the policies of the PAN, and continues to serve as a legitimation for the policies of the PRI, which is since taken power. So I think what was happening with that ad with Místico is that the PAN was appropriating that element of lucha libre that Super Barrio and other sort of leftist appropriations of lucha libre didn't take all that seriously. And that was this idea that there are good guys and there are bad guys. And we have to support the good guys. And one thing that I would point out is that's not terribly convincing, because the kind of meta message of lucha libre is that there are good guys and bad guys, but they're all on the same side, so don't bother. Okay, that's all I have to say. But I would love to hear questions.
We have Mel Haynes here, but I don't think she can't see us. Can you hear us, Mel? And you probably can't hear her. So
we switch the.
Oh yeah, when
we're finished with this, so we can switch that over. Okay, hold on, Mel. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hopefully you'll see us. I guess I'll just Mexican tourist shop, and these are Dr. Levi's, which are a little more
Not really that bad.
authentic.
I bought them outside of the arena.
So, we do have some clips in at some point. Maybe we'll show you both a little bit of Lucha Libre after we've gone through some discussion, and also those from you. So you have some images, because the images are really pretty. When you're talking about it, it's kind of go into the narrative and you go into the politics, but when you actually see it happening, it's also a different sort of experience. And I think, Dr. Levi, in your book you talk a lot about the physicality of it, right? So we'll try to show some of that. And I just asked Nell to talk for a couple minutes in reaction, kind of to talk about what her research was in relation to Dr. Levi's, because she's working with women in Bolivia and a different sort of lucha. You there?
Yes.
Go.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Okay, well, I still can't see you, so I feel like slightly awkward just kind of talking at myself. But I think, well, so one thing that's really important to know from the start is that the sort of history of Lucha Libre, the trajectory is that, as Heather was talking about, it kind of started in the U.S. and moved to Mexico, and then it was actually Mexican luchadores who, in the 1960s, right around when all of the sort of big film boom was happening, went to South America and trained a lot of luchadores there. So, in a lot of ways, Lucha Libre in Bolivia is kind of a child or a product of Mexican Lucha Libre. So it has a lot of the same conventions. There's less masking. Some, mostly men, do wear masks, but not all. But again, everything that Dr. Levi was kind of describing about the tension between real and fake or not real, and the sort of performativity of it is very similar. And again, I think it really does reflect sort of current social conditions in a similar way, but obviously those social conditions are quite different in Bolivia. So my research was on these women who wear the traditional pollera. Did you show pictures already, or?
No, not yet.
Okay, well, you'll see it soon. That's associated with indigenous women. So a lot of sort of the social aspects, the conditions that are kind of being reflected in Lucha Libre there have a lot to do with indigeneity and a sense of modernity and the tension between the two. So the women only started wrestling in these costumes in the early 2000s, which is actually just after indigenous movements began to really become more prominent. It certainly wasn't the first time in Bolivia's history, but there was a big sort of resurgence of indigenous movements in the 1990s. So I think it's no surprise that we kind of see this character emerge at that particular time. And then a few years later, Evo Morales, who is Bolivia's president still, but he's the first indigenous president of the country, was elected in 2005, took office in 2006. And so again, I think particularly after he took office, there's been increasing sort of debate and discussion about what exactly it means to be indigenous in Bolivia today, because, I mean, certainly indigenous peoples are still, don't have the level of resources and sort of social capital that more white appearing or white acting or even mestizo people have. But they're sort of gaining, they're becoming more prominent in politics, in, just sort of larger social circles. So again, there's this tension of what does it mean to be authentically indigenous, and I think something that gets played out a lot in the conversations about Lucha Libre in Bolivia is this idea of, well, can these women really be indigenous if they're wrestling, and also is this wrestling really, good wrestling if we have these women in indigenous wrestling that are coming in and kind of shaking things up. So this has resulted in a lot of tension in sort of different trajectories, certainly between the men and women who wrestle. The men wear sort of the spandex costumes, much more similar to Mexican luchadores. They're wearing spandex bodysuits in most cases, sometimes masks, sometimes not. Or at times they're sort of dressing in these, there's a mummy character, a military character, so they have these kind of very sort of heightened characters that at times they dress as, but again, never as indigenous characters. So there's tension between a lot of the men and the women, because the men feel that the women are sort of, they call them payasas, clowns. They feel that they're kind of detracting from the legitimacy of lucha libre in comparison to other countries. Because again, Bolivia is a small country. It's economically has one of the lowest GDPs in the Americas. So they sort of see themselves in a marginal position, and they see these women's characters, or the women themselves, as detracting from their legitimacy, particularly in comparison with the U.S., with Mexico, and with Japan, that are kind of the big countries for professional or exhibition wrestling. But at the same time, the women are actually becoming incredibly popular for tourists. They've been featured in National Geographic. There have been several documentaries made about them. So they're attracting audiences, but the men feel that it's kind of the wrong kinds of audiences. And then there are all of these discourses sort of circulating outside of specific Lucha Libre circle about the women as sort of a bad example of an indigenous woman, or at the same time, a great example of sort of women's empowerment, indigenous women's empowerment. So most of my research has kind of just been looking at these different tensions that are happening, and particularly in terms of the indigeneity piece and how these women kind of reflect and contribute to debates about what it means to be indigenous today. So again, going back to the Mexican example, I think there are a lot of parallels with sort of ideas of progress and modernity, but also the ways that nationalism and other sort of ethnic ideas within the nation get wrapped up in things. So I'll stop there.
Great. So let's take some questions. What would you like to talk about?
You talked a lot in the book about U.S. pro wrestling kind of as a point of comparison. And the other thing that I kept thinking about while I was thinking about Lucha Libre was the kind of superhero masking that goes on, and so the kind of popularity of like the Batman and Robin series and all of that stuff. And that didn't seem to, like, to my recollection, didn't come up in when you were talking about the kind of function of masking. And I was wondering if that was something that you thought about, and just for whatever reason we're like, oh, this is just not part of the scope of this, or they seem similar in some ways.
They are similar, and there's a connection. But the thing about drawing these connections is that there's a kind of ambiguity in it. Okay, two things. One is that I think that although I was comparing Mexican wrestling to U.S. wrestling, I may have been more cautious than I needed to be about insisting that Lucha Libre is its own thing, and it's not like Mexico gets every idea from the U.S., right? It is the case that at the time Mexicans were picking up the mask, they were also reading superhero comics from the U.S. which featured masked characters, especially the Phantom was really popular. But those masks were popular in the U.S. too, and yet masking never became an important element of U.S. professional wrestling. So I was more interested in this question of not even so much what's the inspiration for the mask, because the inspiration the original inspiration for the mask in Mexico was Cyclone McKay coming up to Antonio Martinez and saying, hey, can you make me And the other thing is that the stock answer to that in Mexico is that, well, the Aztecs wore masks, right? It's like this continuous line from the Aztecs to Arena Mexico. And I don't know if any of you have seen Lucha Underground. I haven't actually been able to stream more than like an introduction to it. But they make this explicit they construct this explicit myth about Lucha Libre originating with the Aztecs. Didn't. And the masks didn't, but I think that a taste for masking is something that was already present in Mexican rural culture and Mexican urban culture, and that it just sort of fit in that particular historical moment with this new practice of Lucha Libre. Yeah.
I'm glad that you mentioned Love and Rockets. I was trying to, after reading the book, I was trying to remember when I first encountered it, and I realized that it had been reading Love and Rockets. It was the first time I ever encountered Lucha Libre. One thing which jumped out at me was the concept that in Lucha you didn't have direct criticism of the breed, but it was a way to almost model how life under the tree was for people without being overly threatening. And it felt to me like there was a connection between that and, say, Carnival, which, you have the same ability to look at structures of power and even make fun of them without being so threatening that, things come down your head.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I think that one of the theoretical, the theoretical groundwork that I may not have made that explicit in the book was really looking at how Victor Turner saw ritual as this way that society brackets off some element of itself and sort of holds it up to look at. And so, yeah, it was, first of all, like Carnival, it was, I don't know that it was a ritual of inversion in the same sense that Carnival was a ritual of inversion, but it certainly, I believe that it was this way for people to kind of be cheering and booing and articulating the fact that the political system looks a lot like this performance. Now, here's my if I were on my committee, but thank goodness I'm not. That was something I came up with. Now, is that true of Lucha Libre's audience? I'm not sure. And since part of my argument is that it was not fully conscious, I don't know how you would go about figuring that one out. It's like if you ask people directly, that answer might not be very meaningful, whether they say yes or they say no. Yeah.
Dr. Haynes, can you also hear the questions?
Yeah, I can.
So I have a question for both of you. So we're taking this class, Performance and Ethnography, and a lot of what we're thinking about, or at least like me and I think some of my classmates are thinking about the ethics of doing ethnography. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your positionalities as American researchers, and in conversation with scholars like Raywin O'Connell, who think about what does it mean to get data from the South and have theory come from the North, and like what kind of powers, structures is this reproducing? Being a North American scholar and doing research in the global South. So I'm hoping that both of you could just talk a little bit more about how you thought about your own positionality researching in these environments and in these countries.
You first now.
Okay. Well, so I guess to start with, this is sort of the easy part of the answer, but I was training with a group for a while, and actually not very long, probably about 2 months before they decided I was ready to perform. And I did not feel ready to perform, but I did several times.
No. You were training as a Tortilla wrestler?
Yes.
Wait. As a Cholita in Pollera and everything?
No, just as a wrestler.
Okay.
In general. Well, and I guess that was an interesting conversation that happened when they sort of decided as a group that I should, you know, get into the ring in performance. They asked, ¿Cómo quieres entrar? How do you want to enter? Like, what sort of character do you want to be? And I did not want to wear a pollera. I did not want to be a Cholita. I didn't feel that was appropriate in a lot of ways. And they sort of briefly encouraged that, but eventually sort of settled on this kind of Wonder Woman-esque persona called Lady Blade, that they promoted as sort of, you know, North American character. You know, I did some sort of brief interviews on local TV about how I had come to learn sort of the more agile wrestling style of South America as opposed to North America, or at least the US, where it's more sort of brute force oriented. And all of their publicity started to revolve around, like, it's an international contest now between this North American woman and the Cholitas Luchadoras. So in a lot of ways that positioned me in a very particular way, but also in a way that at least they understood as sort of contributing to their publicity, getting more popularity, and I felt sort of like that was I mean, it's certainly not an even trade necessarily, but I felt as though I was sort of, in some ways, being used, but in the same way that I was using them. You know, they were using me for publicity, I was using them for sort of information and to get a PhD. So there was some trade-off. I mean, certainly in terms of kind of a larger idea of what it means to be, you know, a North American, well-educated person studying or doing work among sort of working class, you know, whether it's Mexican or Bolivians, people who occupy a very different sort of social, geopolitical position. I mean, I think obviously there will never be equity in what happens. You know, like, I can build a career off of my research, and these people, you know, maybe I get like 20 more people to go to their wrestling event, but clearly that's not on the same level. But I do think I've worked with, there's actually a graphic design student, he just finished, a Bolivian man, who is designing a video game based on the Cholitas Luchadoras, but he's been really instrumental in advocating for them to get like subsidized healthcare from the city, and sort of more, basically just more support from the city for Lucha Libre in general, but particularly around issues of sort of health and workplace safety. So I've been working with him a lot, and I see that as one small way that I can try to kind of contribute and give back to these people who have, you know, supported me in a lot of ways. But again, I think anthropology often trades on continuing the power structures that exist, and I'm not sure there's much an individual anthropologist can do other than kind of on an individual level and advocating for the people you work with.
Not
Yeah,
even
well, what you said. I mean, this is a difficult one for me because in some ways I'm not entirely convinced that the power dynamic is always that important. You know, that it depends. And in the case of Lucha Libre, it's like, yes, there's a relationship between Mexico and the United States. And there's a relationship between the Mexican middle class and the people I was working with, and the US middle class and the Mexican middle class, right? But, while I understand the significance of the critique in general, that we go and mine, you know, get data from people who are relatively disempowered, and it becomes gains value when it's translated into the academy. Believe me, it doesn't gain that much value. But the value, yeah. But I mean, it does gain some value. You have to live in the world, you know, and so I kind of wonder, okay, so what's the alternative? In some cases, the alternative is a much more collaborative relationship with the people you're working with. But the people I was working with wouldn't have really, I don't think that they would have been interested in any more collaborative relationship with me than the one that I had. The people I was working with fell into basically two categories. They were either my wrestling teacher and the people in the class, and from their perspective, I was just some weirdo from North America who was learning Lucha Libre. And, you know, Luis Caramillo, you know, what he would say to me was, he claimed that there was a time when he was very famous outside of Mexico. I don't know if I believe him. But it's not impossible. I mean, the circuits in and outside of Mexico are different. But what he would say to me frequently is, you know, but I know I'm going to be famous after my death. I don't know if he's alive or not. I doubt that he's alive. I lost track of him years ago. He was not in great health. When I was training, there was one night when he came in to teach, and it was like really late. He came in late, and like his above his lip was kind of red, and it turned out he had had a heart attack the day before, and gone to the hospital, and they said, "You're fine now," or he said he was fine now, and came to give class. He's, you know, he was an older working class Mexican man. I doubt he's alive. But anybody who reads the book now sees his name, right? So in that sense, I feel like I did what he asked, you know. I mean, he didn't ask. He said, "I think I'll be famous after I'm dead," and this is maybe what I did was give him that fame, that posthumous fame. It's not much posthumous fame. I don't know who reads the book who's not assigned it, but and I don't know if people remember the name of the wrestling teacher. But I mean, he was the person I owed the most by far. And the other people were professional wrestlers, and some of them it was, you know, useful for them to have somebody who knew somebody with a car who would give them a ride. And some of them it was like they were doing a big favor, not because they are from the disadvantaged South and I'm from the advantaged North, but because they were big stars and were probably making, you know, more money and having more influence than I will ever make or ever have. So, you know, I don't know. And I mean, the other thing is, so okay, then what do you say you do? I mean, one thing you can do is really advocate for more egalitarian relations with other people studying performance in other parts of the world. But in the meantime, do you just sort of stop the dialogue? And does that help anybody to just stop the dialogue?
Yeah. My favorite part of this is about Lucha Libre. My favorite part of the book was the chapter on the mask. I loved that chapter.
Yeah, that was the best chapter.
Yeah. And particularly about how you know, the mask resonated with Mexican political discourse and also reflected it. The other major thread that runs through the book, or one of them, is about gender. And I'm just curious, how much of that particular, your reason for using that particular lens was because of the way that Lucha Libre had been examined, and wrestling in general had been examined before, and how much, as a woman trained as a luchador in a field that's kind of dominated by men, did you feel pressure to examine it through that particular lens? So I'm just curious about your reason for that particular lens.
Well, I mean, there were two reasons. I mean, and certainly, yes, as a woman training in Lucha Libre with these men who belong to a culture and a social class in which they are like stereotyped as being machista, right? But just going right over my head. They could have been like making all sorts of double entendres that I wouldn't have caught, and they might have been talking about me in the locker room, I don't know. But in terms of the way that they interacted with me, I never felt in any way disrespected. And if you study Mexico, a lot of what you read about Mexico is about this very rigid gender system. And I think that I mentioned this in the book, but like the first time I went to see Lucha Libre was with this Ecuadorian sociologist who was talking to me about, you know, how machista Mexicans are, not like Ecuadorians, like himself. And so we went to see it, and you know, like I showed you that El Santo clip, and I guess there are some clips of Lucha. I mean, it's just, to see it live is very different from seeing it on a screen. It's just like, it's exciting, it's colorful, and so I was like really pretty psyched when I got out of there. It was like the first time I'd ever seen it. I decided I wanted to study it, and I really liked watching it. And he says to me, you know, well, what it really is about machismo. It's just about one man dominating another. And then there's all this stuff that just doesn't fit. And then, again, you know, if you study Mexico, you read a lot about the Mexican gender system, and you start to wonder if it's all that. So, yeah, I mean, the fact that I was a woman training in this like theater of machismo meant that I had to analyze it. But it also helps that like one of the other first matches I saw, like probably the third match I saw, was that one in Puebla when it was two exóticos. And so again, it's like, okay, something's going on here which is very different from what what's his name? Juan Franco said. Yeah.
I think either of you can answer this question if you'd like. I was just curious about, in terms of your work and how it resonates today, you talked a little bit about the kind of the nationalistic connections, but I'm just curious, like, what do you hope resonates today and continues to resonate in the future, and what do you feel is at stake in this work that you're doing?
At stake for whom, I guess.
Yeah.
I think that Lucha Libre remains, as does U.S. professional wrestling, a lens through which we can look at the kinds of tensions and contradictions that exist in society, and in U.S. society. And the differences between them say something about the way difference and conflict are working out in each of those societies. But, you know, I don't know really what's at stake, you know, like what's at stake for whom. But, you know, one of the things that I think is interesting, but I can't even think of a way to theorize it now, is that if you look at Mexican popular culture in the late 2000s, we're not going to get there yet. But you know, in say after 2006, so much of it has been shaped by the drug wars. So many sort of narco characters that circulate. Not Lucha Libre. So, you know, an interesting question there would be why. And I don't think, but I mean, in any cultural performance, what's at stake is what does it tell you about what's going on? Yeah.
You said there haven't been many drug characters in Lucha Libre come up
Yeah.
since that time. Have there been other characters that have come up in that time?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's always new characters. And I mean, there might be one or two narco characters, but from what people have told me and from what I've seen, they're kind of curiously absent. There's always new characters and there are always old characters to get excited.
Okay, so first I'm going to comment on the recycling of characters. In Bolivia, that was a big, again, something that kind of played into the tensions between authenticity and sort of being presentable on a world stage. Was there were a lot of people who would use Mexican characters that were either older or still in use and just kind of make cheap reproductions of their costumes and use the same name. And then there were other wrestlers who really sort of frowned upon that and thought that people should come up with their own characters and not be derivative and essentially be more creative. So again, I think that was something really important in this sort of tension between being an authentic luchador and not being seen as sort of like this marginal little country that just is derivative of Mexico. In terms of what's at stake, I think to think about it more broadly, popular culture, media, performance is always kind of, not always, but usually and hopefully reflective of the sort of issues in society. And I think it's a way that people can kind of play out possibilities. I'm just thinking of even like Saturday Night Live right now and the elections and the ways that people can kind of talk back and find a voice through these sorts of things that might seem superficial or unimportant or less serious than like economics and politics. They're actually really important ways that people can come to understand or find relief from sort of oppressive conditions or play with their position in the world. So I think that's a really important sort of way that not just but a lot of different kind of performance related fun things are actually really important in people's